Hello, good morning and welcome to this webinar titled ISO 45001 webinar series, part 3 of 4, and this is focused on planning, which is based on policy, risk and opportunity. Today on the panel is Andy Thurgood, who is recognised globally as an expert in occupational health and safety. He has over 20 years experience in industry, lean and continual improvement, auditing first, second and third party training, and is a chartered member of IOSH. In addition to this, he's also built up extensive experience in assessment in many different certification for standards, such as ISO 9001, 14001 and 18001. I'm Zoe Mobley and I'm here to help facilitate your presentation today. So let's get started. I'm just going to hand you over to Andy now.
Good morning, everyone, and you join us today from a bit of an overcast Milton Keynes. Hopefully the sun shines on you wherever you are. We're going to be expanding on the previous sessions that we've gone through. So those of you that have been with us through the journey might remember that we started off looking at the context of the organisation. We had some slides and discussions, debate around leadership in the organisation, and last time consultation, participation and communication. And we're going to be building on that today. So really the points I want to get covered in this morning's seminar are a refresh of the high-level structure as applies to 45001, the high-level structure itself coming from the ISO directives, Annex SL, Appendix 2, which some of us might be familiar with. We're going to have a look at a process approach that you can take to planning, talk about some of the terminology involved, and give consideration to the risks and opportunities, not only in the traditional sense of health and safety risk, but risks and opportunities as applied to the occupational health and safety management system itself, and ultimately how you then develop these risks and opportunities into plans that you can action and objectives that you can set to drive the risk out of your business. So that's the core coverage of this morning's session. So let's have a look at high-level structure and refresh ourselves of whereabouts we sit in this series of webinars. As I say previously, we've looked at clauses 4 and 5, and we're getting into the meaty subject of actions to address risks and opportunities and planning today. So we're very much in clause 6. And there's a number of clauses that have great significance within these standards. Certainly 4, 6 and 8 have a very direct relationship. As auditors, very often when you look at operational controls, the foundation of effective operational controls is very much embedded from clause 6, and clause 6 is very much informed by clause 4. So again, these are fundamental clauses in the way that we actually start to approach the system and understand how they interact with one another. So I thought this would be a useful slide to throw into the deck itself, because although we've always thrown this or shown this line of a 10-clause structure, it's helpful just to take a step back and holistically look at what your 45001 management system is there to achieve. So within the yellow box, I'm taking you to the introduction to 45001 that looks at the aim of the standard, which is ultimately to prevent work-related injury and ill health to workers and to provide safe and healthy workplaces. So that second element is really focusing on enabling safe and healthy workplaces, which should in turn then enable you to achieve the the first aim. The other thing that we should always bear in mind when we're looking at any management system standard is the scope. What essentially is this standard being gauged against? What are we trying to achieve? And we talk about intended outcomes. And it can be very helpful to think about intended outcomes at every stage of application of a 45001 system. You have the intended outcomes of the system in its entirety, of clauses, but also when you go to your organisation's activities, tasks as well. What is the intended outcome of this activity? Okay, so it's a primary focus. So when we look at the management system, the intended outcomes should be including the continual improvement of OHS performance, We'll look at some terms and definitions around that a little bit later on. But essentially, you should be getting better at what you do from an occupational health and safety perspective. You are there to fulfill legal and other requirements. Okay, so 45,001 still uses the terminology there that we saw in the old 18,001. Other management system standards, 9,000, 14,000, talk about compliance obligations, but essentially we're talking about the same thing. And the third thing that the scope of 45,001 tells us is that we should be achieving the OHS objectives. So again, very much clause 6 stuff. So that's where we're trying to get to. So how do we get to this element of planning? How it takes us on the journey? The first thing we have to realize in any journey is, what are we all about? What is the strategic direction of our organization? Maybe you make blue widgets, okay? Maybe you offer a consultancy service, but what is it that you do? What is the sector that you serve? And where's your business going? Are you intending to diversify? Are you intending to go into different territories? Because when we start to look at where our organisation is going, then we can start to align our intended outcomes, not only with the standard, but our expectations for that strategic growth as well. And those two elements very much feed into the context piece, and it feeds into the planning piece. So that alone can present some significant challenges for organisations, because sometimes as systems managers, do we truly understand what the strategic direction of those at the very top of the organisation actually is? Certainly in some larger type of organisations, perhaps where you have hundreds or thousands of employees, sometimes the people that provide the governance, the maintenance and the support for the management system have a foot in the door to the top, top management, perhaps don't have the full strategic direction, the full strategic piece. Now, the standard helps us with this through Clause 5 leadership by enlightening our leadership to enable us to be successful. Hopefully, they will give us a clearer direction of where we're going, which then would help us identify our context, which in turn would inform the planning. We obviously need to be supported in those processes. So having the resources, the competencies, the people, the awareness of what we're trying to do with 45,001 to enable us to achieve, some sort of planning. So all those boxes that we see in red are very much planning elements. And if we refer back to the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle, some people know that as the Deming cycle or the Shewhart cycle. The Plan, Do, Check, Act as a methodology has been around, for many, many years, and fundamentally supports all management systems, and standards are written to align to Plan, Do, Check, Act methodology. As I was saying earlier, there is this direct correlation between clauses 4, 6 and clause 8, because ultimately what you're going to see is the fruits of your planning manifest in the operational phase. To know whether those plans have been successful, you will need to undertake some evaluation, and that's really what clause 9 is about. And if your plans haven't been as successful as you'd hoped, or you can find improvement, that's what we'd start to work with in clause 10. So hopefully this slide is perhaps a little bit more useful than the traditional linear flow of clauses 4 through to 10, which is where the requirements sit in 45,001. So we'll be looking at this planning as we start to go through the rest of this presentation. Okay, so I'm going to pass back to Zoe now for a quick poll.
Hi there. So to start off, we're going to ask a question all about what is your biggest challenge for migrating or potentially adopting ISO 45001? Is it resource? And that can be, people, that could be budget. Is it knowledge? Or could it be just organisational culture, really getting that backing from the business? Could it be time, or you just don't know? Thanks everyone for taking part in that. Just feed back the results there. So quite evenly spread. However, it seems like the strongest challenge within the group is organisational culture. But then coming close behind, we've got resource. And then after that, time and knowledge seems to be slightly less. And then about 13% still not sure. So thanks for providing that insight. And now I'll pass back to Andy to continue on with the rest of the presentation.
So 30% organisational culture. There is a saying in business that culture will trump strategy every day of the week. So, I appreciate that culture is a big challenge for a lot of people. Within the standard itself, there is guidance on enabling the culture within the organisation. So we have some alignment there to the leadership requirements. So certainly leadership can actively promote that, and perhaps they do need the knowledge to achieve that. And I think when you start looking at knowledge required in any organisation, there needs to be knowledge around the people at the leadership level. There needs to be knowledge around the people that are going to run and maintain the management system, and of course those that are going to audit and provide the assurance for the management system as well. So again, knowledge in many senses, we're sharing a little bit free here. I mean, obviously we have training courses that can provide that knowledge pitched at various levels. The culture itself, sometimes that comes from the vision of leadership. If people know where you're going, again, that is how leadership enable that journey. And when we start to talk about implementation courses, very often we'd say to people, understand the path of implementation. So, figure out what your gaps are, figure out what resources you need, communicate those, get the support of leadership and share your vision. So I think a lot of these things start to pull together. Resources interesting, and I think interesting on this poll, you could have included possibly time as part of a resource as well. Although the temptation is always to say, resources is financial. More often than not, it's about time management and looking at, perhaps the sort of latent possibilities that exist within people's, roles within an organisation. But again, very hard to tell. It's a general set of data, and like I said, I think the culture is probably not unique. It's something that when we're out in the field providing training or assessing people's businesses, culture is one of those things that comes up time and time again. Lovely, thank you for that, Zoe. Okay, so let's talk about the planning process. Why are we doing planning? Essentially, when we get to clause 6 tells us that the why of planning is threefold. We are doing it to provide and give assurance to ourselves that we can achieve the intended outcomes. So we saw the intended outcomes of the management system in the earlier slides, and that can also be tied up with the intended outcomes aligned to a strategic direction, and also the intended outcome at an activity or a process-based level. And I think if, a really good tip I can give to people generally is very often people don't understand what intended outcomes at an activity or process level is. Once you get your head around that, that really enhances your understanding and application of these standards. The next reason why we're doing this is to prevent or reduce the undesired effects. Okay, so essentially, we don't want things going wrong that jeopardise the health and the wellness of people within the organisation. And really, the last reason is to make sure that we achieve the continual improvement within the management system to, improve, to adapt, to learn from our previous gaps to become more effective at what we do. And then making us better by association. So the first thing we have to understand is what feeds into the planning process. In the earlier webinar, we spoke about internal and external issues that challenge us. So in any organisation, when we're trying to apply a management system, when we're trying to undertake our activities, provide product, deliver service, there are things that get in the way and stop us achieving this. And some of these happen from within the organisation, some of these happen from outside of the organisation. But we need to understand, the parameters that we're talking about, so we can put those onto the table. We'll also have needs and expectations of interested parties, and the emphasis within the 45,000 standard is very much around the worker, fundamentally because the worker is the person that is closest to the risk. So we've got to give consideration to these, but the consideration that we're given within the boundaries of the scope of the management system. And essentially that feeds into the first phase of the planning. So the first thing we want to do is identify the hazards that exist. Okay, so 6121, 6122, very much tied up with the old 4.3.1 in 18,001. So, yeah, identify the hazards that present in the workplace. The element that comes in and is slightly different to 18,001 is not just thinking purely now of the occupational health and safety risk. We are now starting to think of the other risks that present to the management system itself. So, maybe it's the fact you have a lack of auditors. Maybe it's the fact you have a lack of resource. Maybe it is, the culture. Okay, so all of those can affect the support of the system. On the flip side of that, we also need to give consideration to OHS opportunities. So that's kind of the balance to the risks. So what opportunities could we capitalize on that could benefit to the health and well-being and the safety of the workers? And then we've also got the opportunities for the occupational health and safety management system as well. The other thing we need to give consideration to at this stage is determination of legal and other requirements. Okay, so again, in other standards, we call this compliance obligations. We're not really, for example, if you were operating integrated management systems, whether or not you call it within an integrated management system, compliance obligations or legal and other requirements, isn't necessarily a bone of contention, because fundamentally they're addressing the same thing. But we do need to understand what these legal and other requirements are that sit around our planning processes. And those other requirements are going to include things like contract requirements, requirements of trade bodies where we have membership, so those sort of things. This leads us into a doing phase where we have to start to plan actions to address risks and opportunities, both to the workers and to the management system itself. And what we start to appreciate is that, having done the analysis of risks and opportunities, some things will have a higher degree of risk than others. Okay, so essentially, you start to develop action plans or set objectives. You start with your priorities first. Don't focus on paper clips when Rome is burning. Okay, so develop action plans based on your priority and set objectives to drive the performance that you're required in the appropriate area, and then plan to achieve those objectives. And we're going to talk about those in a little bit more depth shortly. It's useful at this stage just to have a look at some terms and definitions. Okay, so within 45,001, risk is defined as the effect of uncertainty. Okay, so in effect, that's a deviation from the expected, and it can be both positive and negative. Okay, so imagine flipping a coin in the air. One side you have a positive outcome, on the other side you have a negative outcome, but all the time the coin is in the air, the effect is actually uncertain. We have another definition for an OHS risk. So this is the combination of the likelihood of occurrence of a work-related hazardous event or events, or exposures, and the severity of injury and ill health that can be caused by the event or the exposure. So again, we're thinking about the risk very often to the workers here. Okay, we then have the occupational health and safety opportunity. Okay, so that's a newer term for us. So that's a circumstance or a set of circumstances that can lead to improvement of occupational health and safety performance. Okay, so it could be, for example, you have enhanced controls, which means from an occupational health point of view, there is less exposure. Or, maybe you introduce new equipment that takes the need for handling out of the equation. Let's have a look at that OHS performance, because we can give you a definition for that in its own sense as well. So that's performance related to the effectiveness of prevention of injury and ill health to workers and the provision of safe and healthy workplaces. Okay, so before we go any further forward, the big challenge to a lot of organisations is, how far do I go here? How big's my gap? How much exactly have I got to do? And I would say that really, when you start to think about these processes, have a look at the product, the service, look at the operations that you undertake. There will be some things that you do all the time. They're your bread and butter. You have a very good understanding of what's going on. And these can then be developed naturally through processes that you might already have in place, or if you're talking about some of these enhanced requirements with the threats and the opportunities that arise to the management system itself, might need to either have some development or start to look at other disciplines within the organisation where possibly there's a chance to capitalize on the integrated nature and the high level structure that underpins these standards. So certainly if we were to talk about occupational health and safety risks, we've probably got existing risk assessment processes in our businesses already. So risk assessments generically, specifically, point of work risk assessments, manual handling risk assessments, DSC risk assessments, etc., etc. So we've got something in place that we can probably map to. So from that perspective, there's not necessarily a reinventing of the wheel. It is also likely that a number of us will either be working with a business management system or an integrated management system. So a lot of these planning tools might already exist in your organisations if you're operating 9001, which is your quality, your 14,001 from an environmental perspective, your information security 27,001, your 55,001, which is your asset management. But there is also another standard, 31,000. 31,000 just been updated, deals specifically with risk management in a far more strategic specialist way. So sometimes that provides some thought as well that potentially we can grab hold of. What is really important though is when we start to look at defining the methodology that we use, is that it is a documented part of the process. So within 45,001 has deliberately avoided the need to overly document your management system. If you read a management system standard and you see the phrasing, the organisation shall maintain documented information, in old language, we're talking about maintaining documents. If we see the language, the organisation shall retain documented information, we are talking about old school records. So essentially there are some minimum requirements that require documented information there. We then start to talk less about procedures and more about processes. Okay, and this is to get people thinking about process approach. Okay, the internal customer as much as the external customer. One man's output becomes the next man's input. So for example, if I was undertaking a task and procurement was supplying me with equipment for that task, if the gloves are the wrong specification or the crane isn't the right size, that has an impact on the next process. So trying to make people think about processes is useful. So when the standard starts to talk about controls, we see less use of the word procedure and far more talk about processes. And within the standard, there are only 3 processes that need to be documented, and 6122 is one of them. We need to document and define this criteria for the assessment of risk. And that's fairly fundamental because if different people have an input into the process, we need to understand how we quantify risk to come up with a consistent approach in application. I've also mentioned that we need to give consideration to legal and other requirements. So somehow to inform our planning, we have to be able to determine what legal and other requirements apply to the organisation. So if you're a micro business, it's likely that you're going to be supported by a consultant. If you're in an SME, it's more likely you're going to have some degree of specialist help or specialist function within the organisation. So it's more likely that you'd have a safety practitioner that could be doing that for you. And in a super large organisation, you might have a greater number of those people, or maybe, which is an emerging trend, you'll subscribe to a compliance-based software package, which you map your organisation's profile to, legislation's identified, and then you use an online portal to demonstrate evidence of compliance. So that's quite common too. But essentially, what you are trying to do within this first blue bubble is figure out what is the legislation that applies? What does it mean in general terms? What does it mean in specific terms to our organisation? Because that will then inform your planning. So we've got to understand what it is. We've got to have access to it, whether that's through consultant, online subscription, or expertise within our own business. We've got to understand how to apply it to our business so that we can take into account these legal and other requirements when we do the planning. So take into account very specific terminology of 14,001. You have to do it. That's basically what it means. Okay, and then once you've figured out what you've got to take into account, you then got to understand, what it means to communicate. So that's internal communications, external communications with regulators, riddle reporting, failures of statutory, insurance inspections, whatever it happens to be. So it's something else fairly fundamental that we've got to get our head around because it very much informs the planning process. Okay, and at this point, we're going to go into another poll.
Okay, so for our next poll question, we'll be looking at when do you plan to adopt, once again, migrate to ISO 45001? So will you be looking at doing it this year, 2018, next year, 2019, or a bit later on, so more 2020 or 2021, or are you still not sure? Are you still deciding? Okay, let's have a look at the results. Wow, so it's looking like a majority are planning to adopt next year in 2019 with a 51%. Then next in line is 2018. We've got 25% of you looking to adopt then, and then quite a few still not sure about when you're looking to progress, and then 8% after that. So it looks like next year is going to be busy. So I'll pass it back to Andy. I don't know if you've got any comment.
Yeah, I think we are going to be busy, certainly over the next year from a certification point of view. Personally, from a training point of view, doing a lot of training on 45,001 at the moment. And I think probably the slide, gives fair representation of that. I think in the earlier sessions we run, and again, not knowing what attendees we got online and how that's changed between previous sessions and this sessions, slight fall back on the early adoption in 2018, very much consolidated view for 2019, and I think that probably represents the facts and certainly what I've seen out in the field when I've been talking to organisations is the realisation that to adopt needs some formalised training, maybe some engagement from leadership. So I think those sort of training packages are sort of being engaged before we've actually started to work on the integration or the building of the system itself. So I think as that realisation comes, I would say also we do public training courses. We come into organisations, do a lot of training with organisations in-house, which adds a lot of additional benefits. The other thing I would say is that sometimes you can actually do some integrated training. So a lot of the training that I do in-house for 45,001 isn't just purely 45,001 training. It is 45,001 tied up with perhaps internal auditing of 9 and 14. So we're giving you that more holistic approach. So it's worth thinking if you are booking training and you had your 14 or 9,000 training 2 or 3 years ago, if you wanted us to look at 9 or 14 in that same training space, that sometimes offers greater opportunities in an organisation, because rather than having 8 people sat around a table, you can get 12 people sat around a table, some cross share and upskilling across disciplines. So something to give consideration to. But no, I think certainly the results there, 51% for next year is fairly what I was expecting to see. Lovely. Thank you for everyone for taking part in that, because it is useful to see how these things track. Okay, so a lot of people might be used to managing health and safety risks and have mechanisms such as standard risk assessments, point of work risk assessments, manual handling risk assessments, but perhaps we haven't thought about risks and opportunities to the management system. So earlier when I was talking about 2 sides of a coin, the effect of uncertainty. We spin this coin in the air. Maybe we've got some negative uncertainty that's going to come down. Sometimes we call that risks, and sometimes we have positive opportunity that could manifest. So really what we're trying to do is give this a balanced approach. And perhaps a useful way to think about this is to apply a table a bit like this. So essentially what we've done on this table is kept it reasonably simplistic and split it into headings that look at issues that are challenging to our intended outcomes internally, the issues that affect those intended outcomes externally, the worker and interested party requirements, and the compliance obligations. Okay, so compliance obligations, legal and other requirements. Okay, so again, maybe these mechanisms already exist within your organization. So maybe those are things that you can, have a chat with some of your colleagues too, and tie into their existing processes. So that's a basic four-line starter, or a four-section starter on the framework that we're potentially demonstrating today. And I would say this is just a suggested tool. This isn't, an absolute. You can use mechanisms out of 31,000 if you so chose. Maybe you've developed some systems internally which are good. So this is just one way of doing it, I should say. So it's not an absolute. The first thing we want to do is identify what the issue is. Okay, and we'll work through some of these examples. The next column is to look at an expected result. Okay, so we normally have an expectation when we look at an issue of what the desired state is. The negative uncertainty is what might go, wrong. What's the adverse consequence? Now, at any point in time, the next column deals with the risk. Okay, now the risk, as I said earlier, we have identified that we have to have a process that really defines the criteria that we're going to use for risk. So most of those are based on a severity probability or an impact likelihood, words that mean the same sort of thing, but something that we can go to within our organisation and say, as we look at the data today, our risk level is whatever it happens to be. And that's important because once you've established those levels and the criteria, then you can start to work with your objectives on your action plan based on the more significant items. The last box there is to look at opportunities, so the positive things that we can do. And this box shouldn't purely just be about mitigation. It's so much more. It's looking further afield and thinking outside the box. Because very often, if we just spent a few minutes more thinking about the opportunity that sits opposite the risk, it's greater than just purely mitigation. It's not shown on this slide. If you could also put a review column on this, so it could be that some areas have greater risk and are more volatile than others. Okay, so for example, in a large construction project, the risk profile would change depending on whether you're doing earthworks or whether you're doing fit out when you've got a lot of contractors working in the space. So it could be that some of these risk levels change. So that's just something else you might want to give consideration to. So let's take the first issue, worker competency. Okay, so we've sat down as a management team and we've talked about some of these internal issues, and someone said, you know what, worker competency, it ebbs and flows. What's our expected result? Well, our expected result is our workers are competent. Okay, so what could be the negative consequence of that? Well, that workers lack the skills, they lack the knowledge, and that increases risk of injury and or ill health. Okay, so we'd put a risk level on that based on the data we've got in our organisation. But the opportunity that comes or arises from that is, well, maybe we can multi-skill workers. If we're multi-skill workers, we're not doing one task and then wait for someone to pick up the next task. So in actual fact, it might make you more effective that way. By having two skills, you're not waiting for someone to come back and do the other skill or undertake that secondary activity, and then someone perhaps chancing it. You've given someone skills to control it. Okay, so maybe you've got some business continuity there as well. Maybe you've got optimization because instead of sending a team of 3 people to do a job, you now only need 2 of them. Maybe there's broader thinking we can apply to this. Maybe we can look at collaborative opportunities. Okay, so sometimes we're in supply chains, upward supply chains, downward supply chains. Maybe there is opportunities to work with our supply chain partners when they have training courses to sit on their training, or vice versa. Okay, so again, people that are working with the old BS 11,000 or the new ISO 44,000, very much tied up with collaboration, and in some sectors that's quite a big tool. So maybe there's some crossover that we can look at there. Let's have a look at an external issue. Okay, so fluctuations in market demand affecting profitability. Okay, so in a lot of businesses, market demand ebbs and flows. It peaks and troughs. Okay, and sometimes that's in quite big cycles. Sometimes those things are more frequent and more transient. But effectively, they do affect bottom line. And the expected result when you operate a business is that you do have a budget to adequately resource the occupational health and safety management system to meet the intended outcome. So it's not just sufficient to resource it. We've always got to go back to the intended outcomes of the management system to meet these compliance and legal obligations, to improve the OHS performance, etc. So we had to keep that in mind when we're thinking about budgetary expectations. The uncertainty is, that we fail to actually improve OHS performance. We fail to fulfill legal and other requirements, and we fail to achieve the OHS objectives. It's greater than that from a worker's perspective, because maybe they don't have the adequate training, maybe they don't have the adequate tools, the equipment, the welfare, or the emergency provision. Okay, so again, you look at your business, your organisation, where does that risk level sit today? What opportunities do we have? Well, we've got an opportunity to sit down and engage with financial directors to understand and enable, how a management system works and what their impact or what their contribution to that management system is. Okay, maybe you were going to, swap out some equipment next year, and as a result of swapping out that equipment, there is a benefit to occupational health exposure. Okay, it might be the finance director saying, do you know what, I've got a hole in my accounts next year. Can we put that off 12 months? Okay, that has an effect on the occupational health and safety performance. So it's not to say that you don't offset it, but you certainly need to be considering those things. So really, the opportunity is to engage with those people and then determine and provide the necessary resources for the management system. Okay, so this clause 7 requirement of determine and provide, and within management system standards, determine in ISO speak has a very specific language, which is or a definition, which is a process of discovery leading to knowledge. Okay, so it doesn't necessarily tell you have to document that process. Obviously, you need to have some degree of auditable evidence for it, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have to document it. But you have to determine and provide the necessary resource. And once you've determined that you need the resource, you have to provide it. Okay, so understanding what those requirements are and meeting those is the opportunity that presents. Let's have a look at a worker, an interested party requirement. And one of the new requirements in this standard, or enhanced requirements, I should say, in this standard, is worker participation. So the expected result is that workers participate in the occupational health and safety management system. The undesired consequence is that workers don't participate, and because they're not participating, key risks are missed. OHS culture is restricted, and maybe you could also have some peer pressure there that stops that flow of information. I think in the last presentation, we were talking about culture within an organisation. And we identified that one of the big reasons why workers don't participate very often is because of this barrier where you've asked an opinion, they've given you information and data on how to improve the system, and then it stagnates in the management system. And next time you ask them, do you know what, we're not going to participate, not going to contribute because you didn't listen to us last time. So, we have a mechanism within clause 5 that starts to hopefully enable this. So the opportunity remove those barriers to participation. So hopefully enable safety committee meetings. Certainly within the UK, they tend to be relatively well enabled. Involvement in incident reviews. Again, if we go to clause 5.4, we can see exactly what participation is all about in clause 5.4e. So that's something else that we can tap into. Let's talk about compliance obligations or legal and other requirements. Okay, so a lot of us will be very familiar with legal requirements whether it be the Health and Safety at Work Act itself, or LOLA, or PURE, or whatever the legislation tends to be in the territory that you're operating in. What very often tends to be more of a challenge for safety professionals is understanding some of the specific safety requirements that are either a requirement of a trade body, or more particularly embedded in the back pages of a contract. Okay, so in this particular case, we have a contract, and we'll just call it contract XXXX. Okay, the expected result is that work is undertaken as identified by contract requirements. The uncertainty is that enhanced requirements specific to that contract are not identified or adhered to. So again, look at the data, figure out what your risk level is. What are the opportunities? Okay, so contract review by commercial, operations, and the OHS departments. Okay, if you operate in the 9001 management system, there is a clause 823 which very specifically talks about this. So again, this shows where multiple management systems can be used to align to one another and potentially leverage one another to be more effective in application. What else can you do? Well, maybe we can go out to benchmark other organisations, incorporate industry best practice, and develop an enhanced occupational health and safety management system. That's to say that our management system becomes the exemplar rather than trying to bring our management system up to everybody else's standard. Okay, so that's a possible opportunity. Okay, so in this brief space of time that we've got, we can't really sort of, delve too much into this area. Again, this is the benefit of doing some of our training courses, because we get to run these in the workshops. We tend to work with examples, a lot of cross dialogue with participants, and actually you get as much from the dialogue in those training sessions as you do from the material themselves. So having identified where these risks and opportunities potentially sit, we have to plan action. And this is what 614 as a clause is all about. So essentially, when we start to plan action, take the outputs from the risks and opportunities, giving consideration to those legal and other requirements, but you've also got to give consideration to emergency situations. We have to understand how we're going to integrate those with existing management systems or implement those into the management system itself. And that includes the other processes that the outputs of our management system feed into. And once we figured out how we're going to do that, we have a set of actions. Okay, within the high level structure, one of the things we have to do when we have actions or objectives is we have to evaluate that the plans we put in place are effective. Okay, so old school thinking used to be we have a plan, we give it our best shot, and then maybe we replan. Okay, we tended to drop some of our planning. This time we should be evaluating it as we go along to give ourselves more chance of being successful and to adapt our plans as we go to achieve that outcome. Okay, I'm going to pass back to Zoe now for another poll.
So for our next poll, we want to know, how effective is your organisation at setting and meeting occupational health and safety objectives? Are you very effective? Do you think mostly you're effective, partially effective, or not effective? Or are you not quite sure? Okay, well, that's good to see. So quite a few of you think mostly effective, although not too many very effective, so still getting there. I don't know if, Andy, you've got any comments to make on this?
I think it's good news. I think if you're a smaller organisation, they would typically tend to have more autonomy and achieve what they're supposed to be achieving. In larger organisations, your blue chip, hundreds of employees, thousands of employees, bigger challenges in pulling that together. But I think essentially it's reflective of what we see. And if you've only got 6% there that are ineffective, then it's not great for that 6%, but massive opportunities. And again, if you can use this standard as a tool that enables the leadership to enable you, then hopefully greater understanding of how it works as a tool would optimize that ability to set decent objectives, smart objectives perhaps, and to achieve those. And again, it's very, data is data, but we've got to be very careful about the data we collect when we look at objectives and potentially driving the right behaviours. We'll talk about that because we're just about to go on to some slides. Okay, thanks for that, Zoe. So let's talk about setting OHS objectives and planning to achieve them. So again, let's go back to this strategic piece. We've had OHS objectives before, and we used to talk about planning to achieve them before. We got some strengthening again in the area of the standard, because one of the enhancements about how we plan to achieve the objectives is to give consideration to the resourcing that's required. So again, very often people used to set objectives and then they used to fail on the achievement of the objectives because there was inadequate resource to get there. So that's certainly identified as a challenge. We've got to understand what we actually want to achieve, and that really goes back to where's this organisation going? What is the strategic direction? What are the big risks for us as an organisation? How do we take where we are today and take us into a future state where we improve tomorrow? So we've got to think about the policy and its interpretation of what that means in our journey for this enhanced performance. We know that we have to consult with the workers, and again, as we identified in the last webinar, workers isn't just the non-managerial workers, it's non-managerial workers, it's the managerial workers, it's top management, it's the contractors we use, it's everyone that does work for the organization. Because if you just set objectives without them being realistic, then you're not really going to achieve anything much. So we talk very often about smart targets. The objective should be specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, time-bound. We also talk nowadays about smarter targets, so specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, time-bound, evaluated, and if necessary, revised. Okay, and the standard talks about this. Why do we talk about that? Okay, I set an objective. Okay. And as part of reaching this objective, I look at an aspect and say, I want to achieve 100, assuming that 100 is good. Okay. And I look at my performance, I get 75. Is that good or bad? Okay. Well, if the world around me hasn't changed, the risk hasn't changed, maybe that's bad. But actually, if a market or a risk has significantly altered, maybe it's halved, then actually I've outperformed, a decline in risk or state that sits around the organization. So this revising of objectives is really important, because essentially when you set an objective, you are dangling a carrot in front of the worker to say, this is where I want you to get. Okay. So if the world around you changes and that carrot's too far away, people say, do you know what? Forget it. Never going to achieve it. Or if it's become too easy to achieve, they'll turn around and say, got it now, and disengage. So, figuring out where you want to get to and what your targets are really important. So smart targets, and again, we see the box on the screen there, measurable and monitored. Okay, so the monitoring enables us to evaluate our position. Measurable actually tells you that you're determining a value. Okay, if you can put values around the targets that you set, not only is it a requirement of the standard, but it will make it easier to track your performance and understand where you're going. Once we've got those objectives in place, we've got to certainly communicate those to relevant levels. And I should say, this isn't just the objectives themselves. This could be action plans in support of the improvement of the management system itself. So it's not just conventional objectives of an AFR of 0.75 or a 0 RID or incidents. This is also about objectives and action plans aligned to improvement of the system. But if I'm undertaking a task or an activity, I've got to understand what those action plans mean to the activities I perform and what's expected of me. They should, of course, include the applicable requirements and be communicated and updated so that they're transparent and we all know how we're performing. And ultimately, if we do that, we start to manage the risk and opportunities that present in the business and therefore hopefully improve the performance of the system. So let's figure out how we're going to do it. When are we going to do it by? How are we going to do it? What resource do we need to support the achievement of the objectives? And it could be that there is alignment with other objectives within the management system itself. So again, Are these objectives that align to the 9001 aside your 45,001 system or your 14,001 system? You might end up with some degree of integration, not only by the subject matter of the objective itself, but also by use of existing management system processes from the experiences you gained with 9,000, 14,000, 27, or whatever management system you've adopted that follows a high level structure.
Some of you have sent through some questions in advance, so we'll go through a couple of those now.
The first question I've got is, risk outweighs opportunities. How can we identify these better? So this stand is very much about engaging with with the workers. And again, we've said that workers isn't just the non-managerial workers, but workers at all levels. So really, there's two things that we need to think about when we talk about risk. There is the risk of the risks and opportunities that present to the occupational health and safety management system itself. So things like IT support, financial support. So from that perspective, it's talking to a lot of those supporting functions and the strategic people in the organisation and identifying risk. And then you've got that element of talking to workers and very specifically non-managerial workers or their representatives, because they're the people that are closest to the occupational health and safety risks and opportunities. So those are probably the two groups of conversations that we're going to be having. I think with the OHS risks, certainly the people that are doing the activity are going to provide you with the best information. When you come on to improvement or broader risk, a lot of this is I suppose it's surveying the social media landscape. It is, if you're a professional member going to branch meetings, if you're in a supply chain, it is benchmarking and getting learns from the supply chain. It is looking at instances that occur outside of our organisation and say, could that occur to us? Okay, so a lot of benchmarking coming on. There is no absolute answer to that, and without a doubt this part of the standard is the one that I think a lot of people say, well, how far do I go? I think I've said it before in previous webinars. As a certification body coming into your business, when we look at risks and opportunities, we trust you as the experts in your field to have knowledge of the issues and opportunities, risks and opportunities that arise from those issues and the requirements of the workers and interested parties. You're the expert in what you do. We are hopefully the experts in the management system application. Typically, this also takes us back to the intended outcome activities and processes. From an auditor's perspective, externally, we are always looking at very often the operational phase. So if we see a lack of control operationally, we would always then go back into the planning phase and potentially the context piece in clause 4. So that's the way we would tend to work. So there is no absolute answer to that. There is obviously going to be synergies with other management systems, which takes perhaps some of that risk identification across disciplines as well. But go out and talk to people that support the management system, talk to people that are closest to the risks, and benchmark others. That's that one in a nutshell. It then says what formats, next question, what formats can be used to show opportunities and risks? So we've given you one mechanism that exists there. It could be that you use ISO 31000 as a tool. It could be that you're mapping across to your 9000 and 14001 system. It could be that there are elements that are picked up in company risk registers. So certainly if you've got existing processes, don't reinvent the wheel, map to them, because that's probably a more effective way of doing that. The next question I've got just come up there is risks and opportunities are identified at a strategic and project level. Is this sufficient? Again, it's very difficult to be specific without understanding the world in which you operate or the specific industry type. But this particular question does raise an interesting question about how you communicate risk and opportunities within an organisation, particularly if you are a project delivering type of organisation. It could be that you're doing construction. It could be that you're offering a consultancy type package. And if you're a larger organisation, potentially you might have this strategic risks and opportunities piece going on. But for that to be informed, you might want to see it at a project level that could feed the divisional level that could then feed a business level. So it might be that you're doing it at two or three levels. So hopefully that's a little bit of help there. Right, the next question I've got here, it's only 3 or 4 words. It just says procedures for ISO 45001. Okay, so I was talking earlier that this term procedures, in old standards we used to be very good about procedures and documented procedures. And one of the things we have to acknowledge within the management system is that procedures can potentially clog a management system up. So these standards are now written in such a way that we talk about processes and the confidence that you have in processes to be effective in controlling the undesired outcomes, so that when we look at an activity or the management system in the whole, the intended outcomes are achieved. So when you start to think about, do I need a documented process? Okay, so again, thinking about documented processes, a lot of that comes from your confidence in the ability to apply the control to achieve the intended outcome of the activities that you're looking at. And the great sort of foil for this would be competency. Okay, so for example, if I've done a job for a number of years and there've never been any near misses, and there's never been any injuries, and there's never been any occupational illness, and when I observe someone performing the function, there aren't any issues, and I talk to the people that are managing that function, maybe when I look at it, that's competent. Do I need to put a documented process in place for that? If you've got a whole group of people that are competent that way, possibly not. Okay, but if you've only got one person doing it, then maybe you do, because there's the likelihood of sickness, absence, so there could be greater risk there, but somewhere you have to draw a line on that. With regards specifically to documented processes within 45001, there's only 3 clauses that require it, and that's 6.1 with the risks and opportunities, 8.2 with emergency preparedness and response, and 9.2 with internal audit. I've got another question here. So this one is, what is the process to migrate with a consultant, i.e. readiness review, step 1, 2 and 3. So the readiness review process that we saw with 9001, 14001 doesn't directly translate into the world of 45001. 3 steps to migration are, you can identify that you want to migrate at a point in time, and then a migration assessment can take place where we look for demonstration of the requirements at that point. It can be that you have a phased migration where the assessor comes in and, as part of the surveillance cycle, looks at demonstration of 45001 at the same time that they're evaluating the system, and then there is the sign-off piece when you have the demonstration of those requirements. Or you can wait to the expiry of your 18001 certificate and then do the migration assessment at that stage. So that's the 3 options that we've got option to you.
Okay, thanks for that, Andy. We have had a couple of questions, but I know we've run over. But just to finish off, we've got, so do all risks need a corresponding opportunity for improvement?
That's a really good question. Sometimes a risk won't have an opportunity, and again, it kind of works on the premise that the starting point is the risk as well. So that's thanks. I can see that's Julie that sent that in. So yeah, if there is an opportunity there, try and work with the opportunity. Think beyond mitigation to truly optimize your chance. Very often, when I used to be assessing, used to look at people and used to look at mitigating action, and you think, actually, if you just went that bit further, you could have got so much more. And that's really what the standards are trying to promote. The other thing as I didn't really sort of talk about when we looked at risks and opportunities, is sometimes the opportunity is what we start with. So, an opportunity could be, let's adopt new technology. Okay, so let's take a drone. Okay, if we look at surveying the exterior of a building, okay, or maybe we're surveying pipelines or ships or something like that. When we used to look at buildings, we used to strike a scaffold, and then you've got the cost of the scaffold, the environmental impact of the scaffold, the risk of scaffolders, because again, high risk activity, and of course it's there for a while at a time. Actually, if you got rid of those and used a drone, then actually we could survey with a drone and a camera. Great opportunity, but to operate that drone, we have to understand the compliance of the legal and other requirements that sit around airspace, and we have to have competency that we might not have. Okay. Another opportunity could be to, secure another contract. Okay. So maybe we bid a contract and we secure a contract, and until we get up to speed on that, the resource is squeezed. Okay. So we're trying to manage two contracts with insufficient resource. So the opportunity is to secure the contract, and that could have an impact from a risk perspective. So again, try and balance, risk with opportunities, but you're not always going to have an opportunity for every risk, and vice versa. But do try and apply, some reasoning to that process.
And also, just a reminder, if you've enjoyed today's webinar, there is still one more left in the series, which will be taking place on Monday, the 18th of June at 10. And that will be Andy as well, focusing on implementation and improvement. And I'll send through the link for that as well. But I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank Andy for his time and his webinar today, and of course for you, the audience, for joining us. I really hope you enjoyed the webinar. So thanks again, and we hope to hear from you soon. Bye now.